Hey guys, what's up? Dr. Medic here. In this video, we're going to do what every TF2 YouTuber has done at this point and talk about underrated weapons in TF2. I wanted to take a break from more of the out there stuff and just bring it back to the basics and talk about TF2 itself. These are weapons that are thrown to the side, are overshadowed, and or get undeserved hate. If you want to skip the rules / description on how the video is going to be formatted, I will have a timestamp you could skip there, so you could just start watching the video right away. But let's go over the rules for this. I will be picking one weapon for every slot, for every class to talk about. Now with this format, that means there are going to be a few weapons that aren't really underrated, because there's technically no weapons in slot that are bad or get a bad rap. Though I'll talk about the most underrated weapon for each slot, one that gets maybe a tad bit more hate than it deserves. I hope that makes sense. I will display the weapon's stats, read them out, I will discuss why every weapon is underrated, and then I'll tell you why I think it gets more heat than it most likely deserves. I'll then give some closing statements at the end. I wanted to make this video, well, because I've been around the TF2 community for a while, technically 12 years, though I really got into TF2 around 2014, and I see a lot of people dog on weapons or call them trash when in reality, they're not. They're just often overshadowed, I guess you can call it. I like to call this phenomena the Liberty Launcher Syndrome. I'm sure you can guess what weapons seem to be on this list. A weapon with Liberty Launcher Syndrome is a weapon that is often considered bad when it really isn't. It is just a bad, in quotes, weapon compared to other weapons that occupy the same slot. These weapons are compared with their counterparts and are considered bad due to the skill curve or the less general use cases they have. You'll see what I mean once we start getting into these weapons. But when compared to all weapons in the game, they're actually pretty good and pretty viable. There are a lot of weapons in the game like this, so I'll have plenty to talk about. Without taking up any more of your valuable time, let's get right into this junk. Once again, we're going to go in class order, starting with the Scout and ending with the Spy. I will leave time cards for you to skip to the class you want to see if you don't feel like sitting down and watching this thing in its entirety. Now, I would love it if you did, but I understand that people are busy and they have things to do, so I get it. So, without further ado, for Scout's most underrated primary, the first weapon we're going to talk about today, I have decided to go with the Shortstop. With the upside of a tighter spread, more damage per pellet, but only having 4 pellets, so technically it's a damage penalty. It lacks the 175% ramp up that all other scatterguns have, only capping out at 150%. But it also fires much faster, having a 0.36 second attack interval instead of a 0.625 second attack interval. The max damage of this weapon is 72 at full ramp up. It also reloads all at once, but it only has 4 rounds in total, a secret 34% penalty, and its reload is about 50% or so slower than the pistol. It also has a secondary fire that gives you the ability to reach out and shove someone a short distance, dealing 1 whole damage. The only listed downside on this thing is a pushback vulnerability, which isn't listed but is actually 20%. The Shortstop. While not hated per se, it is a weapon that is often considered not that good, especially by a lot of community members. The amount of videos I've seen of people calling this weapon not good is just baffling to me, because in reality, that couldn't be further from the truth. I think a big reason why is its secondary attack, and the fact that they removed a very good upside from it, being the 20% health from health packs bonus it had many moons ago, prior to Meet Your Match and after they got rid of set bonuses. People look at the secondary fire and write this weapon off in its entirety, which honestly doesn't make sense. Yeah, the secondary fire is terrible. However, the primary fire is not. It is a great mid-range weapon. While Scout excels at close range, and that is often the argument against this weapon, the Shortstop can do great damage at mid-range, especially with the additional accuracy of this thing. This thing is pretty accurate. It is the closest thing to a sniper for Scout. But being able to do 48 damage from mid-range is not too shabby. It also has a high DPS in man versus machine when maxed out, assuming you don't know about the bug with the soda popper where it allows you to get a 10% faster firing speed, completely ruining the Shortstop, but anyway. It is actually pretty damn good. Now, this thing is not as reliable as the stock scattergun. The stock scattergun is kind of just an all-around really good weapon. The Shortstop does have its shortcomings. Like I said, up close, it's not that great. But at mid-range, this thing is crazy. And I'll admit, this weapon isn't some sort of gem that breaks the game and people just don't know about it because they're glued to the meta, even though that most people are. That being stated, this weapon gets a bit too much hate because people don't know how to use it right. You know, it'd be like using the direct hit and wondering why it's not very good at crowd control. The weapon isn't designed for that. You're using it wrong. You can't just use it the same way you would use every other weapon and hope it works. Even if the class's main philosophy revolves around a certain playstyle, it doesn't matter. This weapon is an alternative, and that goes for both the direct hit and the shortstop in this case. The shortstop is actually really, really good. Now for the Scout secondaries. None of Scout's secondary items are really all that underrated, with only one or two coming to mind at all. But there is one in particular that people do not often talk about or use that much, but is actually pretty good. And the people who do use it they know how useful it can truly be and how much of a crutch it can be. The weapon we are going to be discussing, or rather the consumable we are discussing, is Bonk Atomic Punch. The other option was the Winger, but I feel like that gets a little more use. So we're going to talk about Bonk. Scout's first unlockable secondary, added all the way back in February of 2009. In the current day, Bonk offers you an 8-second invulnerability period, but you cannot fire your weapon. It also puts you in a third-person animation. When the effects wear off, if you have taken any damage whatsoever, you'll be slowed by 25%, up to 50% if you've taken over 200 damage. This all comes at the cost of technically a 22-second recharge. The Bonk is not a weapon that is necessarily considered bad by the community. I don't want to get it twisted. But it is a weapon that is often overlooked. The Bonk can be really good. It can be good for getting past sentries, taking damage for your team, getting the eyes off of like your medic for example, or just being a get out of jail free card. It's worse than the Dead Ringer in that regard, but I believe the reason people don't complain about Bonk as much is because of its longer cooldown and the fact that Scout has many other options which people use more often. There isn't really much for this one. I think people prefer things like Mad Milk due to its high utility, pistols, specifically the Pretty Boy's Pocket Pistol due to its effectiveness as a damage dealing finisher, even though the Winger was supposed to do that, but whatever. The Cleaver due to its spam and its old combo. And when it comes to drink/lunchbox items, people often focus on the Criticola due to that weird history and just odd concept as a whole. Still, it's a very good weapon. I'm surprised that more Scouts aren't using this thing, but I understand it's hard to give up the reliability of some of the other options. Finally, for the last weapon on Scout. The Melee slot is really tough and it's kind of a toss-up. It was between the Atomizer and the Boston Basher. Or if you would have asked me about 6 or 7 years ago, it would have also been between those two and the Wrapped Assassin, but the Wrapped Assassin has been getting a lot more use lately, which is really good to see because it is actually a pretty good item. I think the reason it didn't get a lot of use was because of the old Sandman, but anyway, we're getting off topic. Both of these I think are decent, but are underutilized by a lot of the player base. The Boston Basher is known for things like being able to help you build Uber by sitting in spawn and letting the team medic farm off of you. And a lot of new players seem to gravitate towards it due to it being an interesting looking weapon with an interesting set of stats. Yet the Atomizer doesn't seem to get the same treatment. Now, I could be a bit off, because you only really see this thing for a split second when it's active now. Back in the day, you wouldn't even know if a Scout had it at all until he decides to randomly triple jump in the middle of a fight. So maybe I'm just not seeing it as much because, Scouts are pulling it out, getting their triple jump in, and putting it away. But anyway, here are the stats of the Atomizer. It grants a triple jump while deployed, specifically. Melee attacks while airborne will now mini crit for some reason. Not 100% sure why. There's a 15% damage penalty versus players, which doesn't do all that much, and a 50% slower deployed speed penalty. I think the Atomizer gets underused because many Scouts reminisce about the old days when it was just minus 10 health to jump without having to actually pull it out, making some fights, especially against soldiers and demo men, pretty trivial. And some Scouts don't use it because they don't see the possibilities of using it. It seems weird. Why would I even care about being able to triple jump? It's the more experienced Scouts that understand how many doors this opens. In my shortstop segment, you could see me using the Atomizer quite often to get to advantageous areas. Even in these clips I'm showing you now, this thing's really good. The atomizer offers a triple jump on command for free, just for having it out. That's it, you just need the weapon deployed. You can find some great spots that would be hard to reach otherwise. It also allows you to reach these spots without the requirement of a triple jump from the Force of Nature or having to deal 350 damage to activate the Soda Popper's ability. You can even combine it with the Force of Nature and Atomizer to get crazy quadruple jumps. The Atomizer is amazing in the hands of a competent scout, and like I said, it isn't super underrated as a whole, but I feel like many fail to see the potential the Atomizer has. It really does open a lot of doors for you, if you know how to use it and you know your map. Now it is time for us to move on to the freedom-loving American patriot, Soldier. I happen to be recording this on April 13th, Rick May Day. Rest in peace, Rick May. Soldier's most underrated primary weapon. Can you guess what's going to be in the spot? I mean, I named an entire phenomenon after it. Yep, the Liberty Launcher. Now, before I try to explain myself to the hate mob that just formed outside my door, let's go over the stats of this thing. The Liberty Launcher is equipped with 1 extra rocket in the chamber, holding 5 rather than the standard 4. It also has a nice 40% faster projectile speed, making those shots a little bit harder to dodge. And to cap it off for the positives, it is all tied up with a 25% resistance to your own rockets when rocket jumping, allowing you to rocket jump more, and I believe paired with the gunbows, the damage is reduced to something like 12 or 15. It's pretty insane. Finally, the reason the Liberty Launcher is so despised. All of these upsides, these strong sounding upsides, killed by one single downside. A flat 25% damage penalty against everything, buildings and players. So it's easy to see why this weapon is so hated. The base damage is only 68-84 with full ramp up, compared to the standard 90 with the rocket launcher or 112 full ramp up. I know how bad it sounds, but why am I defending it? Well, because if you remember my definition, I'll plop it up here for a second. It is a weapon that may be overshadowed, but when compared to all weapons in the game, it isn't too bad. The Liberty Launcher is a rocket launcher. It is the epitome of this. It does damage. It is extremely strong. The Liberty Launcher has no splash penalty or anything like that, so it could still be very good at crowd control. It is capable of 2-shotting light classes and medics if they're in close proximity, which with that faster projectile speed can make it a lot harder to dodge, securing a couple of kills you may not have otherwise. And don't forget about that extra rocket either. That is a whole rocket you can deal a good amount of damage with. It isn't something that you can just gloss over and pretend that it doesn't exist. Ooh, but the damage penalty. The amount of times I have survived an encounter because of that extra rocket I wouldn't have had with any other rocket launcher, I couldn't possibly count. And I'm not just talking like, oh, I need an extra rocket to kill him. Oh, I just happen to have an extra rocket, somebody comes onto the screen, hit him with that rocket, it either throws him out of the area, or it actually just kills him outright. That has happened a ton of times. That would have never happened if I had the regular rocket launcher. And then of course the 25% blast resistance is also a nice touch if you like to rocket jump a lot, or you just don't feel like using the gunboats. So, okay, I talked about all these positives, but I must admit, even though I love this weapon so very much, it's my go-to rocket launcher 9 out of 10 times. I have a strange specialized kill streak one of these. I absolutely love the Liberty Launcher. And I do believe it does get unwarranted hate. But I have to admit, 9 out of 10 times, in the majority of situations, it is the worst rocket launcher overall in Soldier's kit. With the exception of the rocket jumper, but I'm not really counting that because it's kind of its own thing. It's not fair to really consider that with the rest of the rocket launchers. It's just that people hear this, they hear, oh, the Liberty Launcher is the worst rocket launcher, and assume that the Liberty Launcher is bad. It is not bad. It's not a good rocket launcher. It is the worst rocket launcher, but it is not a bad weapon. And if you're struggling using it, it's because, once again, you're not playing to its strengths. You have to slightly adapt. I don't know, one of you just said to your screen, what strengths? I know who you are, I heard it. Well, the extra rocket, the projectile speed, and even the blast resistance to your own rockets, while kind of a jumbled mess, can most definitely be used effectively. For holding pressure on the team from far away without reducing the blast radius with a direct hit, allowing you to rocket jump more often without the gunboats or rocket jumper, and that extra rocket is 100% unique. It allows you to keep constant pressure on the enemies. I know some of these are kind of reaches. Yeah, they kind of are, but I have to make it clear that the Liberty launcher, while it is not the best rocket launcher, nowhere near, in fact it is the worst, it is not a bad weapon. Separate that. It is a not great, subpar rocket launcher, but it is not a bad, subpar weapon. And before I go on a whole tangent of incoherence, like I do very often, basically, Liberty launcher is bad compared to other rocket launchers. However, it is not a bad weapon. And I definitely recommend that you give it a try at least once if you haven't used it in a while. We spent a long time on this weapon, so let's move on to the secondaries, which just happens to be a weapon in the same set as this one. That being the reserve shooter. The reserve shooter. Before we break it down, let me give you the stats of this weapon. This weapon gets guaranteed mini crits on enemies blasted in the air by explosive, whether their own or yours, and it also works on people who are using grappling hooks or the thermal thruster. That is the main draw of this weapon, though it also comes with a nice 20% deploy speed bonus for those combos, what the weapon was intended for in the first place. All for the downside of 2 less shells in the tube mag, holding 4 rather than 6. The reserve shooter is infamous, mainly because of its original upside, being 3 seconds of mini crits on airborne enemies after deployment. Now they dropped the whole 3 seconds, which was later raised to 5 later on, system, but originally, it would mini crit against airborne enemies. That's the key word right there, airborne. What airborne meant, all it meant, was that their feet were not touching the ground. Jumping would trigger mini crits. Walking on certain stairs could trigger mini crits. Even swimming for a short time would trigger the mini crits, though that was more of a bug, and that would eventually get fixed. You may see why this weapon was so hated, though nowadays it's just kinda there. Especially ever since Pyro's Air Blast no longer triggers mini crits either. Most people just throw it to the side and think it's crap, mostly because it takes a bit more practice to use effectively. However, I think most of this comes to the fact that people don't think about everything that it has. They don't consider all the stats as a whole. Free mini crits on enemies popped in the air or that blast themselves in the air through sticky and rocket jumping, which is very nice. A faster deploy speed, all for just 2 less shells, which while yes, it does come into play, comes into play a lot less than you would probably think, especially if you're using a weapon that is intended to be used with it, that being the Liberty launcher. The main argument is that 2 rockets is always better. However, that isn't always true. Shooting 2 rockets takes 1.6 seconds, however, shooting a rocket switching and shooting your shotgun at close proximity is when this weapon actually shines. It only takes 1.2 to 1.4 seconds, which seems like a small difference, but in the game of milliseconds, can make or break the battle. You could also potentially do up to 120 plus damage with a hit scan meat shot. Plus think about it, even if you don't want to use it for its intended playstyle, you're still getting a shotgun that deploys faster for only 2 less shells. This weapon does not have a damage penalty. And yes, the panic attack does deploy faster than that, but that weapon also has a wider spread, and the damage penalty requires you to basically be kissing the hitbox in order to do the full 108. So I will say this weapon gets a little bit more flack than it deserves. It's not perfect, especially if you can hit air shots with something like the direct hit, that would be infinitely more effective. But it is a perfectly viable secondary. It has the accuracy and damage of the shotgun, can mini crit enemies while they're blast jumping, or using grappling hooks, if you're one of the 4 people who play manpower, and it deploys quicker, for just 2 less rounds. That's it. 2 less rounds, which, like I said, comes into play sometimes. But if you can hit your shots, rarely are you going to need that 5th and 6th shot, or you'll have time to retreat to reload. Once again, yes, there are exceptions, but overall, it's not as big of a detriment as people think it is. It's not bad, and it's not even bad on Pyro, who can get a niche out of it, because of the faster deploy, the better accuracy than the panic attack, etc., etc. I definitely think it gets more hate, in quotes, well, not really hate, but it definitely gets less love than it deserves. The only weapon that is properly loved in the airborne armaments set is the Market Gardener, but to be fair, that's pretty good. So, reserve shooter, give it a try. It is actually a pretty good weapon. It is slept on a little bit. Soldiers' melees are all properly rated for the most part. The disciplinary action, escape plan, and Market Gardener, very good. Most people would probably agree with you. Most of the community will agree with that sentiment. The Half Zatoichi, it's okay on Soldier. Definitely better on Demo Man, but it's alright. Equalizer and Shovel, subpar. It's pretty universal. They're all rated pretty fairly in my opinion. And I believe most of you will agree with that. However, There is only one melee that I think gets a bit too much hate. Now, it's not the best. I'm not going to say it's slept on. Like I said, there are a few weapons here where it's like every weapon in slot is pretty properly rated, so there isn't one that's like super underrated. Oh man, this is a gem that nobody talks about. So it makes it really difficult picking one. But there is one that just gets a tad bit more hate than it probably deserves, because it's really not that bad. The one I decided to go with was, yeah, the Pain Train. What? Yep, the Pain Train. Remember this thing added all the way back in 2010? The stats are pretty simple on this thing. +1 capture rate for having it equipped, allowing you to have the ×2 cap rate, just like the Scout, all for the downside of a 10% bullet vulnerability. Which is kind of weird. So yeah, this weapon is hated because the stats are active at all time. The bullet vulnerability is definitely kind of harsh, seeing as bullets are the most common damage type in the game. However, specifically for Soldier, it isn't really much of a big deal. 10% more damage from bullets gives you an effective health of 180 versus bullets. Though, while less health sucks, it doesn't really put you over many damage thresholds. You are either going to die or not anyway most of the time. The only one that comes to mind is being two-shot by the stock shotgun if they're right up in your face, when normally it would take 3. Which, honestly, I guess can come into play, but when are you going to get double tap from that close? It's not going to happen often. Other than that, the Pain Train is rarely ever a decider in the fight. That +1 capture rate is also very nice when it helps the soloing capture points, or making things go a little bit faster. I will say this weapon is kind of boring, and I don't think anyone would be opposed to seeing a small rework while keeping the integrity of the weapon. But I think people blow the problems out of proportion just a little bit, because it's not as big of a deal as people make it out to be. But it's definitely there. I will say that. You know, it gets heat for only being effective on a couple game modes as well. And if you're playing attack defend, it is a straight downgrade on defense. And while I think that sucks, the weapon does its job fine. It's whatever. It's nowhere near the best, but it's not quite as crippling as some people would make it out to be. So the Pain Train, meh, it's okay. It's slightly underrated, I would say. It gets a little bit more hate than it probably deserves, but it's okay. We spent a fair bit of time on Soldier's section. It's time for us to move on to Pyro. Pyro is a tough one because most of his options are pretty properly rated, though I still think there are a few weapons that get a bit overhated where I don't think it's very warranted, or they don't get as much love as they probably deserve. So let's start off with Pyro's primary weapons. This primary isn't necessarily hated. In fact, it's loved by a small subgroup of people. However, I think the majority of players fail to realize the damage potential this thing actually has. You probably already know what weapon I'm going to talk about. The Dragon's Fury. One of the newest weapons added to TF2. Almost 7 years ago. Yeah, the last set of weapons were added in October of 2017. Before a lot of you were probably even playing this game, unless, you're a veteran. It was between this and the Backburner, but I see the Backburner far more often than I do the Dragon's Fury, so I chose the Fireball Cannon. The Dragon's Fury is a single-shot burst flamethrower-like weapon. Rather than a stream of gas lit on fire, it fires a single fireball that can penetrate multiple enemies. It deals 25 base damage, however if you manage to connect the middle of a fireball with a player after shooting them once, or finding someone who's already lit on fire, or maybe you used your flare gun for example, it will begin to fire quicker, about 50%, and deal 3 times the damage, so instead of 25, it will deal 75 damage. However, what I said is somewhat false, a little bit misleading. The stats on this thing are a bit misleading. The base damage is actually 75, which is why it does 75 damage to buildings. But while it states that it does more damage to burning enemies, it actually does less damage against non-burning enemies. So the damage is reduced against non-burning enemies, not raised versus burning enemies. Does that make sense? The only reason I said 25 base damage is because your first shot against non-burning enemies, which happens most of the time, is going to be 25. But against buildings or enemies who are on fire, it will be 75. Sorry about the confusion. I know, it's a little bit weird. The only listed downside on this weapon is that the compression blast is a little bit slower, which definitely hurts, but it also technically costs more to air blast. This thing holds 40 ammo because it doesn't use the traditional ammo system that the rest of the flamethrowers do. You can fire 40 of these flame ball things, but it costs 5 to air blast, and if you do the math, that only gives you 8 air blasts, similar to the degreaser, unlike the stock's 10. I think that it isn't so much that this weapon is disliked, but more just misunderstood, as people do not see the insane potential that this thing has. You can easily dispatch light classes in the blink of an eye if you can manage to connect your fireballs, and you can also hit a group of people with it. Well, of course you can do that with the flamethrower. People seem to forget that the Dragon's Fury fireball can pass through enemies and hit the rest of the crowd. It can 2-shot minis at level 1s, and it can 3-shot other buildings, making it the most reliable building destroyer out of all of Pyro's kit. Sure, the Homewrecker does kind of fill that role, at least it's supposed to, but the Dragon's Fury is just better as it could do it from a slight range. This thing does have a slower air blast compression speed, which does hurt, but don't be fooled, this thing can still air blast. Actually, all flamethrowers besides the Phlogistonator can, even the Backburner. I'm looking at you, Backburner Pyro, who took 3 rocks to the face while WM1ing that soldier on 5 CP Gorge. I was watching you, and you just kept running. Remember, Mouse 2, guys, it works on the Backburner. It's had the ability to air blast since, I believe, 2009-ish. So yeah, just so you know. Okay, but to wrap it up, the Dragon's Fury is definitely really good, it's just a bit misunderstood. It does very high damage, it can just absolutely decimate enemies if you can manage to hit your shots, and I recommend that you give it a try. You'll likely find more use out of it if you can actually aim. Now for the secondary. There are quite a few potential candidates for this spot. You have the shotguns as a whole, the detonator, but there is one weapon that is often considered bad when in all reality, it isn't. It's just a bit outshined by the other options. Some of you may want to boo me off the stage, but my pick for this is going to be a laser weapon. The Man-Melter 3600ZX. I know, but give me a minute to explain first what the Man-Melter actually does. The Man-Melter is a flare gun just like any other. It fires a projectile, does 30 damage on direct hit, and lights enemies on fire for a short duration. You get it. The benefits of this thing, however, is that the weapon has a 50% faster projectile speed, being the same speed as the Sandman Ball or the Wrapped Assassin Bauble, at 3,000 hammer units. The regular flare being 2,000 hammer units for reference. This weapon also has an alt attack, which allows you to use it on burning teammates to extinguish them for 20 health and storing a single crit similar to the Diamondback. I should be clear, you can store up to 35, but you get 1 crit for extinguishing. Sorry for the poor wording. This weapon has infinite ammo and doesn't have to reload at all. Technically, it has a short, buffer time, but there is no actual reload animation. This sounds awesome, however it does have downsides. Its downsides are actually not listed in the weapon stat for some reason, except for one, no random crits. However, they do exist. The other downside being that this weapon doesn't offer any sort of damage buff for hitting burning enemies like the other flare guns do. I guess you can kind of say that isn't really a downside, but compared to the other flare guns, it is. Okay, so now that I've explained this, why am I even defending the thing? Well, it's because the Man-Melter, while is not as reliable as the trusty flare gun or have as much utility as, say, the detonator, it isn't all that bad. That's where people go wrong. First of all, the projectile speed bonus is amazing. While some mouth-breathing knuckle-draggers like to make fun of extra projectile speed by calling it a crutch, I don't care. You'll hit more shots, you'll hit them more effectively, more often, and from a longer range. It's a lot harder to dodge it at 3,000 hammer units compared to 2,000 hammer units. Imagine it like trying to dodge the Cleaver or the Wrapped Assassin Ornament. The Man-Melter would also be the best long-range flare gun if it weren't for God's blind spot, the Scorch shit. Though it still does have the projectile speed that makes those shots a little bit easier to land. It also has no damage penalty, meaning it does 30 damage plus the extra 60 from Afterburn, assuming it's full Afterburn. Now, while it can't crit or mini-crit on demand like the other flare guns, it can store crit from extinguished enemies. So if you got a trigger-happy enemy pyro or a secondary shot-happy Count Mangler soldier, you'll be able to store a bunch of free crits. These crits travel super fast, are hard to dodge, and do 90 damage. That's not a little chunk of that's a big chunk of damage right there. If it weren't for the stupid visual bug, this thing would be insane. Though you do get flashbang literally every time you use it, except for sometimes. I'm not actually sure how that even works. There's a bug where you use the secondary fire, you hold it down, and it kind of has an animation where you steal the fire off your teammate, but for some reason when you use the primary fire and you have a crit, that animation goes up again, so it just completely blinds you. Yeah, I mean, it sucks. Also, you do not need ammo for this thing, which is nice, I guess. You can just keep spamming it, but it's not really that big of a deal. So, to wrap it up, The Man Melter may not be as versatile as the older brother flare gun, and not as pestering as the younger brother the Scorch Shot. It is still really good. Oh, and one last thing I thought was interesting. The flare gun was added back in 2008. It didn't have the crit nor mini crit against burning enemies, and it only did 20 damage on direct hits. Meaning, if the Man Melter was released 3 years prior alongside the flare gun, it would be a direct upgrade. No reason to know this, I just thought it was interesting to think about. But yeah, the Man Melter, it's pretty good. I definitely recommend that you give it a try. Sure, it isn't as reliable, like I said, as the other flare guns, but that doesn't mean it is bad. Now for melees. Pyro's melees only fall into 2 categories: extinguisher and utility. All the Pyro's melee weapons are properly rated in my opinion. Seriously, all of them. The only one that I can think is just a smidge underrated, just a teensy bit, is a personal favorite of mine, the Back Scratcher. The Back Scratcher is not a hated weapon, and it's not really super underrated at all. Like, none of Pyro's weapons really are. But I think it's because of the Power Jack's existence that most Pyros don't give this thing a fair shot. The Back Scratcher has 3 stats, very simple. It has a 25% damage bonus, which is nice, bringing up the base 65 to 81, but a damage bonus on Pyro's Melee isn't all that impressive. However, it does have another upside that matters. It also comes with a 50% health from health packs on wear, which most importantly makes medium health packs go from 88 upon pickup to 132. The downside is a 75% less healing from healers, which includes medics, Medibeam, and engineered dispensers. This weapon is really good, I mean really good. The 25% damage bonus is pretty cool. You could 2-shot medics, which can come in handy sometimes. I believe you can also 1-shot soldiers and even battalion backup soldiers, and leave full demo knights at just 1 HP, assuming they're running the booties and the Eyelander at full heads. But the 50% extra healing from health packs is the main draw of this weapon. That's where the weapon really shines. It's really nice if you're a lone wolf pyro, if you like to roam on your own. That extra health has saved me countless times where if I didn't have the extra health from health pickups, I would have been surely killed. It is super nice to have that bonus even if you're not in active combat. It's just nice to be able to top yourself off and get a lot more from medium and small health packs. The 75% less healing from healers is also not that bad and can actually even benefit you. It is similar to how Scout's Boston Basher can abuse the downside of hitting yourself to benefit your team's medic during downtime, helping them build Uber. If you aren't aware, as your heal target gets closer to full and goes into overheal, the rate in which you gain Uber charge is slowed. This is to kind of discourage pocketing and encourage switching up your heal targets in order to gain Uber charge at maximal speed. So taking the Medibeam out of your soldier boyfriend's ass and putting it onto the rest of your team like a good medic. Please, medic. Please. The 75% less healing from healers can also help medics keep a very high Uber charge rate while they're healing you, especially if you start low, because they'll be at lower health for longer. Plus, if you actually need health, a good medic will notice that you're gaining health very slowly and pull out his crossbow, since every medic and his mother is running the Crusaders. Because for some reason, the 75% less health from healer stat does not apply to the Crusaders' crossbow arrows, meaning the downside is pretty negligible most of the time, and can even be a benefit on occasion. The only time the downsides are detrimental is if the medic doesn't notice you're slowly gaining health in the middle of a firefight, which can definitely happen while everything's moving around as crazy, or if he doesn't have the Crusader's crossbow for some reason, which, I'm sorry, that's me sometimes. I like to run the syringe guns, give them a bit of love. It happens on occasion, but most of the time, medics have the Crusader's crossbow, so there's really no issue. The only real downside, I guess, is that, engineer dispensers, that's the only thing that's going to be a constant effect. Engineer dispensers are probably the only thing that come into play most of the time. So overall, the Back Scratcher is a pretty solid pick if you want to roam around a bit, and you just want to make sure that you have some extra survivability. I 100% recommend that you use the Back Scratcher. It is actually pretty good. Now we move on to the explosive loving Black Scottish Cyclops that's also a knight for some reason, the Demo Man. Demolition Man has some of the best weapons in the game, so not too many are all that underrated, but he does have a few. For the first primary slot, the grenade launcher I decided to go with is the Lock and Load. It was between this and the loose cannon, but I feel like people love the loose cannon a little bit more, whereas I feel like the Lock and Load doesn't get the same treatment, because double donks go unfathomably hard. This weapon comes with a nice 25% projectile speed bonus, as well as a 20% damage bonus against enemy buildings. For the downside of one less grenade in the chamber, a 25% explosion radius penalty, making it not so great for crowd control. And to really seal the deal, grenades shatter upon hitting a surface that isn't a player or a building, basically meaning no rollers. The lock and load may not be as good as it once was, but it's still really good. People seem to forget that this thing is a real building deleter and has some stupid range. Demo Man is already a great counter to Engineer. I mean, he's the main counter to Engineer as long as they're not using the short circuit. But the lock and load can two-shot any building from any range and from a pretty far range too. And then of course can one-shot a mini, but so can every other grenade launcher except the loose cannon unless you time it right. While it no longer has the damage bonus against players like it should, it still is a great grenade launcher due to the extra projectile speed. Losing rollers does suck, but directs are what you're going for the majority of the time, and the lock and load makes it a lot easier to do. On top of that, the grenade has no tumble. This is a hidden stat. This wasn't always the case, but around, I want to say 2014. If you don't know what I'm talking about, okay. With any grenade launcher, if you shoot a grenade, the grenade will have a random offset and start rolling in the air. You'll start tumbling, either forwards or backwards. It's random. And because of how TF2's air resistance and drag works, it kind of can offset it a little bit, so you can, it might go slightly to the left, slightly to the right, not as far, a little further. It has some weird variance. The lock and load doesn't have any tumble. And because, like I said, how TF2's air resistance and drag works, this allows the grenade to go significantly further. And it makes it easier for your shots to hit because there's no variance. It's kind of the same with the Iron Bomber, but technically Iron Bomber does have tumble, it just doesn't have as much because of the shape of the grenade. But we're not talking about the Iron Bomber, we're talking about the lock and load. The lock and load's only real drawback is the fact that it has a 25% clip size penalty. Having one less grenade does suck, but it's not the end of the world. Overall, it's not a bad weapon. It's actually really good. It can just absolutely annoy the hell out of enemy engineers. It makes it easier to hit those really long-range shots and pester snipers. There's another weapon that actually pesters snipers, and we'll get to that next. And I highly recommend that you give this thing a second chance if you haven't in a while. So now that we talked about the lock and load, let's move on to my next favorite weapon, the next primary. Okay, so now we're going to move on to Demo Man secondaries. Oddly enough, this next weapon is the reason I wanted to make the video in the first place. It's a bit of a weird choice, but I have been using it recently and have found it to actually be pretty good. People often use this weapon or try this weapon out, but they don't know how to capitalize on it, and they use it completely incorrectly. Then they think, oh, this weapon sucks, and they put it away. But it's actually pretty good. This Demo Man's second primary, the Quickie Bomb Launcher. It was this or the Scottish Resistance, but I recently watched Teal Opal's video, where the Scottish Resistance was included, so I thought I'd stick to the Quickie Bomb Launcher. Before I break everything down, like I so eagerly want to, here are the stats. This weapon has the ability to destroy enemy sticky bombs that are caught in the explosion radius. It comes with a 0.2 second reduced arm time, allowing for spam, but it does have another purpose. And then the two most underrated stats of this weapon, a 70% decreased charge up time and a 35% damage bonus based on charge. For the downside of a half mag holding 4 rather than 8, and a flat 15% damage penalty to start. This weapon is so underrated, and I think it's because, one, the sticky bomb launcher is just so brainless, but two, people use it wrong. The name is Quickie Bomb Launcher, which would have the majority of people thinking it's a spam tool, so you can quickly detonate bombs on the ground. This was exacerbated by the original downside of stickies fizzling out after 2 seconds. I believe it was 4 seconds before they eventually got rid of it. It was 2 seconds when it came out, then it was changed to 4, and now they don't fizzle at all. So you couldn't really put down traps. However, while that is a use case, and you can definitely use the weapon like this weapon has an actual better purpose. People who use the Quickie Bomb Launcher frequently already know what I'm going to talk about. Sniping. Yes, sniping. All thanks to that 70% decreased charge up time and the 35% damage bonus. It seems that some people are unaware that the sticky bomb launcher can actually charge up. I'm always surprised by the amount of people who don't know that. Yes, you can. By holding down M1, you can charge up your sticky bomb launcher in order to launch the bomb a little bit further. And you can actually get some pretty good range too. Well, yes, the further your bomb goes, the less damage it's going to do because you're further away from it. But it still does pretty good damage. This weapon's charge is very, very quick, which allows you to be a little more effective at pestering enemies from a distance, or engineer buildings. Sometimes there's an engineer building way on the other side of the map, and your lock and load won't reach, or maybe you're not using the lock and load, so this weapon can be very good for charging up a couple stickies to blow up their buildings. It also has a nice extra damage bonus, because sure, it's a 15% flat damage bonus to start, but that 35% damage bonus as you charge it up will eventually make up for that damage penalty. It's pretty damn good. I have straight up out-sniped snipers with this. With the quickie, I have found it useful that if there's a sniper that's a good chunk of distance away and has a lot of his team in front of him, which happens very often, you can find a good vantage point and charge up a sticky or two to pester him. And that extra charge decrease time, the decreased time it takes to actually blow up your stickies, can be good for enemies who are a little bit closer than you anticipated. Though it also works in the opposite way. So yes, it can only deal 30 to 40 damage, maybe 50 from a distance, so it's not the best at actually killing, it's just good at pestering, but it actually can also work in the reverse, as I stated. Let's say you have a scout that's chasing you down, which happens a lot as a demo man. Scout sees a demo man, oh, easy kill, because demo mans have hard times hitting scouts. I don't know, I think it has something to do with the fact that he's all projectile based, just maybe. But if you can get around a corner or kind of break line of sight, you can quickly charge up a sticky and throw it on the ground. And then you can just wait for the scout to come after you, which you most definitely will, because scouts have egos the size of Russia. But you'll eventually come through, and you can actually pretty consistently one-tap light classes with just a single bomb. There's been many times where I've done over 130 damage. Because remember, that 35% damage bonus is actually capable of putting it over the damage threshold for killing one-tapping light classes. The amount of times I have actually one-shot overextending scouts is insane. And as we know, scouts can be a veteran difficulty level challenge if they're good with their movement, but this can definitely deal with them. So it's great at sniping, it's great at dealing with enemies who are close to you, it could be a spam tool, it's really, really good. The only thing that holds it back is the fact that it only holds 4 stickies in a single mag. 4. It used to be 6, and it wasn't a big deal because, 2 less stickies, but now you have 4 less stickies compared to stock. So you have to make sure that you are aware of your ammo count. Make sure that doesn't get out of your sight. But anyway, the Quickie Bomb Launcher is super good, very versatile, and I definitely recommend you use it if you don't. Or at least give it a try. That's it for demo secondaries, or second primary as some may say. Let's move on to his melees. When originally pitching for this video, I was going to have this segment be about the Persian Persuader. That one Demo Knight weapon. The Persian Persuader is overshadowed by the Half-Side Ouija and Eyeliner most of the time, but I was thinking about it, and I do see the Persian Persuader a lot more than I see this other sword. And this other sword is pretty good, but it's often overshadowed because people use it wrong. I obviously also could talk about the Pain Train here, but I talked about the Pain Train in the Soldier segment, so we're not going to talk about it. We're going to talk about the Claymore. The Claymore? However you want to say it. I call it the Claymore. The Claymore gives you an extra 0.5 second of charge for the downside of no random critical hits, just like every single sword, as well as a 15% damage vulnerability on wear. It also has the extra melee range and slower deploy of all other swords. So cool. This weapon is not hated, but it is underappreciated, mainly because people are trying to use this as a Demo Knight weapon. It is not. So there's Demo Man, Demo Knight, what else is there? Well, of course, there's the mixed breed, Hybrid Knight. You see, the 15% damage vulnerability on wearer isn't entirely accurate, as it has the white text right here at the top, which states that the effects only apply while the weapon's active. This means that while you only get an increased charge while the sword is actually out and deployed, you don't get the damage vulnerability while it's holstered. So as long as you don't have it out, you're not going to take any additional damage, which is great. This is perfect for Hybrid Knight because you can have your grenade launcher out, for example, and then when you need to charge away or charge into somebody who's really far away, you have your Claymore. It's perfect. The extra charge duration is amazing, allowing you to have more efficient getaways, have a higher chance of catching fleeing enemies, and then charging from further distances, being less detectable for screeching at the top of your lungs and charging forward with a blue or red glowing sword that is exceptionally long. The Claymore is fantastic, and it's a fantastic Demoman sword. They really all are, but I definitely recommend you give the Clay a try if you haven't in a while. But make sure that you try it with a Hybrid Knight loadout instead, so you can utilize the primary upside of the additional charge duration while also not having to suffer an effective health of 170 booties. I love this sword. But it is time for us to move on to our next class. Personally not a favorite of mine, but he does have some underrated weapons. Let's move on to Heavy Weapons Guy. Here we are. Really, all of Heavy's weapons are pretty good. There isn't one that's technically bad. Well, I guess except for the eviction notice. But when it comes to primaries, I mean, it's pretty hard to screw up a minigun that could delete any class in under a second. Every single minigun is pretty good. There's just one minigun that I think gets a little bit more flack than it really deserves, in all honesty. That being the Hulong Heater. I have in recent times seen people start to warm up to this weapon, no pun intended, but it is still often on the back burner. The Hulong Heatmaker, as it was called on launch, has a ring that pulses a couple times per second and lights anyone on fire who gets too close, assuming their feet are touching the ground, which will make sense later. It also has a 25% damage bonus versus burning enemies, which is always nice. However, it has a base 10% damage penalty and consumes 4 ammo per second for just being revved up, meaning if you are firing at the same time, you can quickly run out of ammunition if you aren't paying attention. People see that 10% damage penalty and that ammo consumption and think, man, this minigun just sucks. When in reality, that is completely incorrect and couldn't be further from the truth. While yes, ammo consumption does suck, as you could just quickly run out of ammo, if you are cognizant of your ammo count, you shouldn't have really any issues. So yeah, and while the 10% damage penalty does suck, this is a minigun for God's sake. It still does well over 400 damage, which in most cases isn't going to make the difference between this and, say, the minigun or the Tomislav. Well, I guess the Tomislav has a slower firing speed. It could actually beat out the Tomislav potentially. And if they're really close to you, you light them on fire, boom, extra 25% damage on top of that. The fire ring is nice for when you're in a crowded area, so you can hit people multiple times, or hit multiple people at once, I should say. Just don't try to use this from high ground because you may actually blind yourself, as the ring is always visible beneath your feet. Which is annoying, but it's not terrible. You can also expose spies who backstab you. While yes, a spy could jump over it, that does require the spy to both know this trick and perform it correctly. It's totally doable, but still, the ring of fire can definitely be a deterrent. You know, it may not be the end-all be-all for the spy, but the spy will be less likely, or at least think twice, before trying to stab you. And then, of course, like I said, you're in a small room, close proximity with everybody, you can light a bunch of people on fire, and you do that extra 25% damage against burning enemies. You get nearly the damage of the Brass Beast, but move at normal heavy speed with normal heavy spin-up time. It's really good. The Hulong Heater, or the Hulong Heatmaker, depending on when you first play this game, is just stupid good, and I'm not 100% sure why it gets neglected as much as it does. Some people say this is even the worst minigun, and in my opinion, that is incorrect. It's definitely not a bad weapon by any means. Now, this next one, however, may be a bit more of a controversial pick, and I'll definitely have to sort of explain myself a lot more. This next one is always a fun one to talk about. For heavy secondaries, I decided to go with the shotgun. And no, this is not a joke. The shotgun is the shotgun. You've all used it. 10 pellets, a base damage of 6 with a minimum of about 3. Technically it's a bit more, but it rounds around 3. And a max at 9, allowing for a max damage hit to deal 90 damage. I'm sure you all knew that, but just in case. Okay. Hear me out on this one. I know what a lot of you may be thinking. That I'm joking. But I am not. The shotgun is a seriously underrated item for heavy. Prior to about 2010, the minigun used to rev up 25% slower, and you used to move a bit slower as well, moving at 80 hammer units compared to the day's 110. To put into perspective, Sniper moves at 80 hammer units while charging anything except the Huntsman. It made sense in the past, because the minigun was such a commitment to use. However, when they buffed the speed in which heavy moves and revs up, the shotgun became a little bit less of a mainstay. The thing is despite this buff, the shotgun is honestly still pretty good. You see, people think that the shotgun is only useful for Fat Scout, but that's just because they aren't thinking far enough ahead, and they're not very creative. I'm just kidding. But while I cannot deny the versatility of the sandwich and other lunchbox items, the shotgun is still pretty effective. The minigun takes about 0.87 seconds to rev up, which can definitely be the difference between life and death in a game where you can be pretty much deleted instantly. Well, maybe not as fast as something like Call of Duty, but the time to kill is still pretty quick. So the best time to use your shotgun is to, one, pester snipers that are shooting at you, so you can jump around and make it a bit harder to get hit, while also making the snipers aim flinch. Thought I'd throw that in there. That is actually a really good use case for this weapon, but here's the main use case for it. When walking through corridors, it can be a good idea to have your shotgun ready to blast enemies away, especially mobile enemies. A competent demo man or soldier can deal with you before you even have time to rev up your minigun, even with something like the Tomislav. However, if you have your shotgun out, you could jump, dodge, and weave while applying pressure. The shotgun is still pretty strong. Yes, it's only 90 damage, but it can 2-shot most enemies, 3-shot soldiers, and I guess in a heavy battle, honestly, yes, you'll probably lose those, but you have a better chance of winning against 8 of the 9 classes if you can dodge and weave, if you know how to move around. Because while the shotgun, like I said, doesn't do as much damage, it is still really good. And it's really effective against scouts. Scout Scattergun does more damage. Its max ramp up is 104 compared to your 90. It should be 105, but for some reason it comes out to 104. Not 100% sure why, but whatever. Here's the thing. You have 300 health. Normally you are extremely vulnerable as you move at a snail's pace. And yes, the minigun does do a ton of damage, and the majority of the time it is the best pick, but the shotgun can be really useful for enemies who are able to peek or jump up and around you, like a scout. I mean, you've all seen it, and if you're a scout main, you've probably done it, jumping around the heavy's head. However, the thing is, that's only when the heavy's fully revved up. He can't move around that much. If you have your shotgun on you and you start jumping around too, it can make it a lot harder for you to get hit. I have used this technique multiple times. Fighting scouts, instead of pulling out my minigun, I'll pull out my shotgun and jump around, and they'll start to miss. Whereas if I have my minigun out, revved up, shooting them, especially with something like the Brass Beast, which I don't use much, but, on occasion, it makes me a sitting duck. That's all I'm going to say. Is it as good as the majority of lunchbox items? No. Those will be more useful the majority of the time, I have to admit. But remember, this is about underrated weapons, not weapons that are really, really good. Necessarily, just weapons that get mistreated when they really shouldn't. But seriously, do not sleep on the shotguns, any of them. The Panic Attack is good, the Family Business is good, but specifically I was talking about the stock shotgun here. Sometimes it's better to pack heat rather than packing lunch. Now, it is time for us to move on to the melee weapon. Okay, I'm going to be honest, all of Heavy's melee weapons are pretty properly rated, so this pick is going to be kinda weird. I only picked it because people do not actually use it for its intended purpose. If you play TF2 for more than 30 minutes, you already know what melee weapon I'm talking about. That weapon is the Holiday Punch. Like I said, it's a weird pick, but just give me a minute to explain. The Holiday Punch is a weird weapon. Its upsides is that upon a successful critical hit, whether random or via its built-in on-demand crit system, it will cause the enemy to play their Schadenfreude animation, their laughing animation, making the enemies, laugh. It will guarantee crits from behind if you manage to hit them in the back, obviously, and it will always make enemies who are wearing the Holiday Punch laugh, similar to how the Half Zatoichi always kills someone who has it active. I actually didn't know that was a stat, but it's very rare that I've ever ran into another Holiday Punch heavy who was actually using the Holiday Punch as intended. And I'm going to be completely honest, I'm not a friendly killer, but I don't hoovy around a lot. I really don't. The only downside to this weapon is that crits deal 0 damage. Literally, it doesn't do any damage, and that's the only downside listed. The normal hit still does 65 damage, which has always been kind of weird to me. It's a downside that, is pretty unique. It's actually completely unique to the Holiday Punch. This weapon is often used on, like I said, hoovies or friendly players to show their friendliness, or the sandwich is usually with the sandwich and or second banana. Which is funny because when you use this weapon legitimately, you always get the enemies who kind of second guess themselves when you pull them out with the intention of actually using them to kill. The Holiday Punch is pretty much a straight upgrade, so you don't have to worry much about anything, which is very nice. The thing is while Hoovies are the ones who utilize this the most, the Holiday Punch can be effective for stopping pushes when an enemy gets too close and you have to hit the panic button a little bit. Of course, you have a minigun, which is most of the time going to be your best bet, or even a shotgun if your base is hell. So the melee weapon is your last resort. However, there is one place where this weapon shines, and that's against Ubered enemies. You see, there's not much you can do against Ubered enemies as a heavy, really. And really as any class. You got the Lose Cannon on Demo Man, you got Air Blast on Pyro, but there's not much you can do. And you actually have the secondary attack on the Cowmangler, which actually knocks around Ubered enemies. I learned that just recently, actually. But the Holiday Punch can force Ubered enemies to go into their Shout in Front animation, which is super cool. And you can basically just completely screw over their Uber because the person you just hit can't do anything about it. They have to play their entire animation, which can take about 5 seconds, basically draining the Uber. If you can get to like a vantage point above the Ubered enemy and just kind of drop down onto them, just screw them over, it's glorious, it's awesome. I've done it a few times. I don't believe I got any footage this time because it is kind of hard to pull off on occasion because you kind of have to know the Uber's coming and they can't see you, but it's definitely happened. Like I said, most of all Heavy's melee weapons are pretty properly rated, so there isn't really much to say. However, I'm surprised at the lack of Heavies who actually run this melee as intended. Yes, the Gru and Fist of Steel are hard to pass up, but the Holiday Punch is a direct upgrade and it's not too bad. Anyways, that is the end of the Heavy segment. We've been going on for quite a bit. It's time to move on to the other class that doesn't require you to actually even play the game. Engineer. Alright, Engineer. Ooh, Engineer. Engie doesn't really have many weapons to begin with, so there are a few weapons that are really underrated since every one of them was pretty well tested. You know, it's a little easier to kind of keep in your mind what weapon's the best. So this is going to be really, really tough. The primary I decided to choose to talk about for the Texan Man is really not underrated at all. It's just that I see it far less than any other weapon besides the Thompson, which in my opinion is pretty properly rated as one of the worst designed weapons in the game. Not even the weird Uber and Cloak Drain can save that piece of garbage. Anyway, no. The weapon I am going to be discussing, like I said, isn't super underrated, but I see it a lot less than I probably should. The Panic Attack. The Panic Attack isn't disliked, but I had to put something here, so I went with this. The Panic Attack has gone through many iterations. The current one works like this. It has 50% more pellets for a total of 15 rather than 10. The weapon deploys an astounding 50% faster, which makes it lightning quick for switching back and giving your enemy a face full of buckshot. Or maybe birdshot because of how many pellets there are, but anyway. This weapon has a wide but fixed pattern as well. Meaning, while yes, it is wider than the stock shotgun, it is fixed, meaning it's not going to have any sort of random bullet spread. The downsides of this weapon are that successive shots without stopping become wider and harder to hit, as well as a 20% damage penalty per pellet. This weapon excels at being a shotgun. I mean, like a video game shotgun. The stock shotgun is more akin to like a real-life shotgun in my opinion, being good up close. Well, probably would be able to one-shot most people in real life, whereas you can't really do that as much in-game. But anyway, it has decent mid-range. The Panic Attack excels up close and hits like a truck. While the pellets have reduced damage, you have significantly more of them. If you're at a range, you're likely to do no more than sneeze on them. But at point blank, where the shotgun would shine anyway, the Panic Attack absolutely smokes every other shotgun in the game with the exception of the Force of Nature. And even then, the difference is 5 damage, with the fan doing 113 and the Panic Attack dealing 108, 4 more than the stock scattergun. So here's the thing, the Panic Attack has no increased knockback, which means that if you stay up against, let's say, a soldier, you can pretty easily 2-shot them. You can 3-shot heavies even easier since, well, they already have reduced knockback by default. And he's most likely revved up, so, well, he's not going to be moving much. It's easier to get that full up close, ramped up damage. The Panic Attack can be great for dealing with spies who get too close as well, The spy has to get close to you most of the time anyway in order to do anything, unless of course he remembers he has a gun, which most spies don't, so you don't have to worry about that. This thing dispatches the spies using the kunai and big earner in one hit and completely cripples those who are not. This weapon is really good, switched to really quickly, it has a fixed pattern which makes it very predictable, it does a ton of damage up close, it is just phenomenal. Panic attack does what the shotgun does best, and it shouldn't be slept on at all. That would be it for Engineer's primaries. Now it's time to move on to the secondaries, which will be interesting since he only has 3. You can probably guess which one I'm going to choose. Remember, this is about underrated weapons. There's only 3, so I'll tell you right now, it's not the Wrangler. It's the pistol. Yeah, did you think I was going to say the short circuit is underrated? Not in a million years. As a soft demo main, I say soft because I switch classes frequently, I absolutely despise that thing. So, the pistol. The pistol it's a pistol, pretty straightforward. 12 in the magazine, 200 reserve, unlike Scout's 36. Always thought that was kind of weird. The discrepancy between Scout's and Engineer's ammo pool is super large. I can understand maybe double, triple, like 72-ish, but Engineer has over 5 times the amount of reserve ammo. It's strange. 15 base damage, max of 22, fires fast, you get it, it's a pistol. It's pretty straightforward. The pistol, like the panic attack, isn't super underrated as a whole, but people seem to over-rely on the short circuit and Wrangler. While those items are super good, people seem to think that the pistol is just not competitive. This could not be further from the truth. The pistol is a great finisher tool when you're just out of metal or you don't have a sentry gun in your line of sight, you know? It can be a good weapon to pull out after you just got done dumping your whole tube mag into a spy with 30 health and only managing to do chip damage. The pistol can be a far-range assault tool as well. With 12 rounds, you can shoot the enemy from afar to make them flinch or scare them off. People think, oh, it's 8 damage at that range, it won't do anything. But you'd be surprised by the amount of people who will see that they're taking some sort of damage, freak out, and run away. Even if it's 24 to 36 damage and you only hit like 3 to 4 shots. And sure, 24 to 36 damage really isn't going to kill anybody, but it can definitely be a deterrent to advance unless you are up against a soldier or something like that. Especially if they got a medic girlfriend pocketing them. Soldier and a heavy can probably shrug off 30 damage, but other classes, 30 damage is a good chunk. I keep saying 30 because, like I said, hit 3 to 4 shots, but you could hit more. The pistol is a great secondary. It does what a secondary is supposed to do, and it does it quite well. All I can say is that yes, the short circuit and Wrangler are really good, of course, but if you want to be an aggressive, more like battle engineer, or you want to be up in the fight, the pistol may be the weapon for you due to its reliability. Engie segment, like his stature, is quite short. We're moving on to the melee weapons. There isn't much to talk about the pistol. It's pretty straightforward. It's the pistol. So let's move on to Engineer's melee weapons. So, for Engineer melee weapons, I just decided to go with the one weapon that people often have in a loadout but don't actually use, just abusing a slight oversight. Engie mains already know what I'm referring to, the Eureka effect. The Eureka effect has had a long history and always been kind of a weird item since the start. Starting off as a simple 2-stat weapon, and then it got a few new stats, but it always kind of sucked, to be honest, until it became what it is today. The stats are that you can press reload while having your wrench deployed to bring up a little menu. Pressing 1 will bring you back to spawn after playing an animation, and pressing 2 will play the same animation and will bring you to your teleporter's exit should you have one. The teleporter does not have to be active, it just needs to be deployed. Engineers know this trick. It also lowers the cost of teleporters by 50%, which is funny because the Eureka effect received the stat when the price of tellies was lowered from 125 to 50. So now they cost 25 per, which is kind of funny. And it also costs only 100 to upgrade rather than the standard 200, which is where the oversight comes in. You only need to place the teleporter with the Eureka effect. So engineers, what they'll do is they'll have a loadout with the Eureka effect, place the teleporter, and switch to the wrench of choice after to get that reduced upgrade cost and reduced initial cost too, I guess. It's pretty smart, actually. The downsides of this weapon is a 50% decreased wrench boost speed, making it a little slower to redeploy, and also a 20% less ammo from ammo packs and dispensers penalty. The Eureka effect is far from perfect, but don't get it twisted, it's not a bad wrench. The Eureka effect, while being used just as a small, cheaper telly trick often, is actually a great wrench on its own. While most use it than engineer, which is definitely viable, and engineering, if you don't know, is when an Engie will place a teleporter exit near the enemy spawn in a secret place, often not active, so it blends in more, because like I said, you don't actually have to have the teleporter active, and you know how hard it is to spot a teleporter that isn't active, because it's small, low to the ground, there's no color, you get it. So what they do is they wait for the enemy to move up, then they use the Eureka effect to sneak behind them, build a sentry or something, and yes, of course this is an option. Though the wrench works outside of this gimmick playstyle as well. While the wrench boost speed penalty sucks, it isn't the end of the world, and the upsides more than make up for it 99% of the time. Making teleporters quicker for setup, not literally, but sort of. Because you don't have to spend as many resources on the teleporter, you could spend more of your resources on other buildings, as now it only takes 250 metal to get the tele up to full, rather than 600. Which is accounting for placing both ends and upgrading them. The main draw of this weapon is good too. If there are no ammo packs nearby, you can quickly teleport to spawn and grab some ammo from the locker before teleporting back. One downside is you actually have to walk up to the locker now. That used to not be a requirement, but whatever, it takes 2 to 3 seconds. It can also allow you to get to the front line much quicker, leaving your teleporter open for teammates, since you could just immediately teleport to your exit. You don't have to walk to your entrance and take up valuable time. Finally, it could be a really good escape tool in a pinch when there is nowhere to run. The animation does suck and it locks you in place for a few seconds, but it has saved me more than enough times. It's pretty good, and it's not something that should be overlooked. The Eureka effect may have sucked 8 to 10 years ago, but those times are now gone, and it's a pretty good wrench in today's age. I think they should remove the stupid 20% less ammo from dispensers and pickups. That is unnecessary, but whatever, this is not a weapon balance video. That was in March. Eureka effect, great weapon. That will do it for engineer. Moving on to the support classes. First at the bat, medic. Medic also doesn't have that many weapons to choose from, having a pretty small roster. Surprisingly though, it was pretty easy to figure out which weapons I want to talk about. For the syringe gun, because of course it's going to be one of the syringe guns, what, did you think I was going to choose a crossbow? God no. The syringe gun I decided to go with is the Overdose. The Overdose is unique in the fact that the upside scales not with a mechanic on the weapon itself, but rather the Uber charge meter, similar to how the Frontier Justice works, and it's tied to your sentry, not with the weapon itself. You know, if that makes any sense. Typically, a weapon has a mechanic that it feeds off of, but this feeds off a completely separate mechanic. Alright, I'm just making it too confusing. Anyway, it increases your base movement speed by 2% for every 10% Uber you have, up to 20% at full Uber while the weapon is active. All for a 15% damage penalty, which makes this thing effectively do 1 less damage than the stock syringe gun, which really just shows you how useless the stock syringe gun is. I know why this thing isn't used. The crossbow exists for when you want to actually be a supportive medic. It's better in most ways. It does better damage for the most part. Yeah, and it heals your teammates, and yeah. And then of course you have the Bloodsucker. It's a great choice for medic old heads who want to try to do what they did back in 1999 on TFC and go full battle medic because they can't get the stock syringe gun to work. Or, of course, they just like the survivability, either or. The Bloodsucker has its place. The Overdose is often looked over as people just don't understand the point of this weapon. I always hear people say, what's the point of this weapon? The weapon has to be active. And yes, that does suck. That means you aren't actively healing your team. That's true, I can't deny that. But the thing is, this weapon isn't supposed to be used as like a standard weapon. Right? It's not the same as the crossbow, it's not the same as the syringe gun, it's not the same as the Bloodsucker. This is actually a getaway tool, and it scales with Uber, because the more Uber you have, the more vulnerable you are. If you're at 90% Uber and a bunch of enemies run in, it sucks not being able to get away after all the time you spent building the Uber. Though if you're at like 0% Uber, it matters a little bit less. So that's kind of the thing, you know, you get more Uber, you get more speed. It's kind of how it works. I know some people think this should just have a flat movement speed bonus, and that'd be cool, but, you know, this isn't about balance. I'm sorry, I like to go off track sometimes. However, with the Overdose, you can quickly pull it out at a higher Uber charge percentage in order to escape. And realize you don't have to turn your back on enemies. For some reason, there's this idea that, oh, you're going to turn your back and they're just going to kill you. If you have high enough Uber as medic with the overdose, you can actually run faster backwards with the overdose than you can moving forward without it. Moving at 115% rather than 107%. So you can run and shoot needles in order to deter your enemies from chasing you. Everyone seems to think that needles pretty much do nothing, and while yes, they are pretty pitiful against high health enemies, and compared to something like the minigun or shotgun, yeah, it's definitely not as good. But it can still do 90 damage per second, which while low, can still be enough to deter a cocky scout or a low health enemy from continuing to chase you. Enemies aren't always aware of exactly how much damage they're taking, so they see their health being depleted really quick and decide that you're not worth it. And especially with the low health, you're much more willing to chase down a medic, but if they're constantly pestering you with needles, you might be a little less willing to chase them. I know as a demo man or soldier or pyro or whatever, if a medic starts shooting a bunch of syringes at me and I'm low health, sometimes it's just not worth chasing them down. And the overdose allows you to get away much quicker. In addition, if you face forward, you run nearly as fast as a scout. This weapon is great as a getaway tool. And it's decent at suppressing fire because it only does 1 less damage than stock. And it could be used to get back to the front lines if you wanted to, if there's no scout to latch onto, for example. If you just want to get back to front lines and you happen to have higher Uber, or even at least some Uber. Maybe you're farming off your AFK teammates. There's always a few. Anyway, the overdose is not some super weapon that just hasn't been awakened yet, but it is definitely underrated. The overdose by no means is a bad weapon. It's just, I guess, bad compared to the crossbow. That would be like saying the airstrike is bad in general. No, it's bad compared to the standard rocket launcher, right? The rocket launcher is one of the best weapons in the game, but it's not a bad weapon. You can still definitely get some use out of it. It's just not as good as other rocket launchers. It's the same here. So if you want to shake things up, this would be your best bet. I definitely recommend the overdose. Now that that's out of the way, and we've been talking about this for way too long, let's move on to the real moneymaker, medics, mediguns. I was quite literally using this medigun in the last segment. I mean, this is the only medigun that would actually make sense for this. People know the power of the Vaccinator, people know the power of the Kritzkrieg, people know the power of the stock Uber, but people always sleep on the quick fix. The quick fix suffers because it doesn't have as much of an identity as the others. Stock is your all-arounder and a great stalemate killer. The Kritzkrieg causes devastation, but not as much survivability. The Vaccinator is a mistake. The quick fix, however, is often forgotten. The quick fix has a flat 40% faster heal rate, which increases the base heal rate in combat from 24 health per second to about 34, and out of combat brings the base heal rate from 72 up to about 101. The quick fix also has a unique Uber that offers a 300% faster heal rate, which means if you're in combat, it can heal an astounding 101 health per second, and out of combat closer to 303 health, meaning that you could heal a heavy up to full in about a second, which is pretty insane. It also gives full resistance to knockback from any weapon, air blast, the loose cannon, force of nature, anything that has any sort of major knockback. The quick fix also comes with a 10% faster Uber build speed and allows you to mirror your target's blast jumps or shield charges. It used to also allow you to run at scout speed. Well, it was the only medigun that did. However, every medigun would eventually get the ability to do that in, I believe it was Meet Your Match. So it is no longer unique to the quick fix. I don't even know why I brought that up. Anyway, the downside is a 50% max overheal penalty. And then, of course, the fact that Uber charge doesn't make you invulnerable, I guess. The quick fix suffers because, once again, it really doesn't have an identity like the others, and people often don't like it for pushes. To be honest, this weapon best shines if there are 2 or more medics on the team. I know, that's really rare for casual, but you have one medic run stock or crits, and the second medic run this, or I guess max. But we're specifically talking about the quick fix, because the Vaccinator is a little bit better while defending compared to attacking, but a good medic can make anything work, I guess. The quick fix is just a really good survival tool for your teammates. Like I said, it's not the best for pushes, especially into a group of a lot of enemies, and it doesn't offer you the damage of the Kritzkrieg or invulnerability of stock, so once again, yeah, it's not great for big pushes, but it is a phenomenal medigun for keeping your teammates alive out of combat. They come back from the front lines, you patch them up way quicker, allowing them to get back into the fight and apply more pressure. The Ubercharge is also good when one medic pushes and there isn't a ton of enemies and you need to cap a point or something. This medigun is a bit slept on and can be a good pick for a supportive medic. Once again, this medigun is best for small pushes or if there is already another medic on the team. This probably shouldn't be the medigun that you go for if there's only one medic, or, you know, unless you're playing like Capture the Flag or something, where then it really doesn't matter. Why are you even playing medic on CTF? Whatever. But while this isn't all the time, especially in a casual setting, it can be good to have as a backup. It's a great medigun, it's slept on, but now it's time for us to move on to medic's melee weapons. You might be surprised by my choice, or maybe not, I don't know. What could go here? It's definitely not the Uber Saw. That just wouldn't make any sense. Is it the Amputator by chance? That's a pretty good weapon without really any downsides to speak of. A 20% damage penalty, like what's that? Is it the Sullen Vow? That basically doesn't have a downside and it offers you an amazing passive benefit with a 10% swing speed penalty that was thrown onto it so it wasn't a direct upgrade anymore. At one time it was. It was kind of a, hey, here's some red text, you know? That's a pretty good weapon, and it has its fans. The Vitasaw? I don't know. No. I'm gonna go Rogue. Fans of Array 7 already know what I'm going to go with. The good old-fashioned Bone Saw. The Bone Saw is a stock melee weapon for Medic. You know, 65 damage, 195 damage crits, that seem to happen all the time because Medic gets infinite crits, 88 damage mini crits, you know, you get the deal. It is outshined by the Uber Saw pretty hard due to the utility of it, right? The Uber Saw is just insane. However, while the Uber Saw is hard to pass up, the stock Bone Saw is not a bad weapon by any means, and I think it's where people get tripped up the most. It has the same issue as the Fire Axe on Pyro. Well, Pyro is more because Pyro needs his melees to be utility since he already has a close range weapon that can do a lot more damage. It makes a little more sense for him, I guess. But what I mean is they both have weapons that offer something more than just damage. I mean, only about 4 of the classes in the game can really make their stock melee work. That being Demo, Engie, Sniper, and Spy. Stock is pretty good on those classes, and specifically for Demo, Engie, and Sniper, their melee work the exact same. Besides Engie's ability to obviously upgrade buildings, keep them alive, etc., that's unique to the engineer, but the weapon itself works the exact same. They do 65 damage and swing every 0.8 seconds, and hit hard. The Bone Saw is no different. The Bone Saw has the highest DPS out of all medic melees with the exception of the Vitasaw, but the Vitasaw lowers your max health by 10, bringing it down from 150 to 140, so your survivability is a little bit worse. The Bone Saw is quite literally the best melee weapon for defending yourselves when things get too close. Sure, infinite random crits on medics exist, which slightly offsets this need, but especially if you're playing on something that doesn't, like a game mode that doesn't have, or excuse me, a server that doesn't have random crits enabled, you know, it's nice. And those aren't always plentiful, even on servers that have random crits enabled. You're not always going to get lucky and have a bunch of random crits stored. The Bone Saw is a strong melee that is often considered bad, when in reality, it just isn't. It's, yeah, sure, its younger brother gets all the praise, but that doesn't mean the older brother is bad at what it does. I'm not saying to give up the Uber Saw, but I'm saying that the Bone Saw deserves some love. It is good, it does a good amount of damage, and it is very reliable. It deserves it. It worked hard and gets nothing in return. I mean, there's not really much to say about the Bone Saw. The Bone Saw is just a stock melee, so there's not really much I can go into. So I guess with Medic complete, we move on to, oh, you know who. Let's talk about it. I'm kidding. Sort of. Sniper is one of the strongest classes in the game, able to dispatch 5 of the 9 classes in just a fraction of a second, and with a bit of patience, all of the classes, even a full overheal heavy, assuming he isn't actively using a weapon like the Brass Beast, Natasha, or Fist of Steel, or maybe if you're using one of the weird manpower power-ups. I haven't played manpower in years, I'm not even 100% sure. And he can do this from a dark corner 3,000 hammer units away, where nobody will be able to see him. Sniper's primaries are pretty strong, I believe we all know this. However, there are two that are slept on. I like to give an honorable mention to the Sydney Sleeper, the OG body shot king. The Sydney Sleeper is my favorite rifle out of all of Sniper's rifles because it does what Sniper is supposed to do: support, offering your team an opportunity to deal 35% more damage to enemies. It also requires some patience in order to do any sort of real damage, and it can't be spammed, I guess? Wrong word, but you know what I mean. This isn't about the Sydney Sleeper though. No, this is about an OG weapon. A classic, if you will. No, the classic. The classic is a carryover from Team Fortress Classic. It doesn't work exactly like it does from TFC. In fact, not at all. It's completely different, except for the look of it is pretty similar, I guess. And then one main function. That is that charging, rather than being tied to your scope, is tied to how long you hold down M1. So if you hold M1 for a few seconds, it will charge up to full, like it did in Team Fortress Classic. That was the main upside of this weapon. This does help keep you from tunnel visioning or hitting those close-up shots that you can't really do as easily with the lower field of view. So it makes it a little easier to do some damage, you know. And you can also jump while charging, which is cool, I guess. You can move around a little bit, kind of see your surroundings. The downsides, however, are why people tend to hate this weapon. The weapon has a 10% damage penalty on body shots. Okay, that's not too bad. But it also cannot crit unless it is fully charged, which is why this weapon is absolutely hated. But why am I defending it? Well, because it's a goddamn sniper rifle. This thing has Liberty Launcher Syndrome almost as bad, if not worse than Liberty Launcher. It is bad compared to sniper rifles, but it is not bad compared to any other weapon in the game. The Classic does require some patience to actually use effectively, since you have to wait the full 3.3 seconds in order to headshot. And it's less broken compared to stock, Bizarre Bargain, and Machina if you ask me, but that's the thing. It's still a sniper rifle. You can delete classes from across the map, but you can still take out overhealed heavies without the aforementioned weapons that could negate this on literally any other sniper rifle you're using with the exception of the Machina. It's still extremely strong. No damage fall off, nothing like that. And yeah, I know it's bad compared to other sniper rifles in pretty much every way. However, it is not bad as a weapon as a whole, and I think that's where the problem lies. The thing is one of the strongest weapons in the game, but it is the weakest in slot. The weakest of the bloodline, if you will. I do think the no headshots while fully charged mechanic is a bit overkill. Maybe it should mini crit or something like that. You know, kind of like how the Sydney Sleeper does now. The Sydney Sleeper got that ability. It used to not be able to headshot at all, just like the Classic, but it got the ability to at least mini crit on headshot, which did improve and, you know, gave you a reason to actually aim for the head. But personally, I like this concept since it actually requires a commitment to a kill or to a target before obliterating them from a million miles away. The Classic needs work, no doubt. But don't forget that it is a sniper rifle. It is on sniper, and it can put in the work just like any other sniper rifle. It's just slower. The sniper rifle is not a bad weapon. It is just kind of underwhelming compared to other sniper rifles. You could still make this thing work. For my secondary, I also have two weapons, or a weapon class rather, but specifically one of them I really want. The SMG and Cleaner's Carbine. The SMG family is often underrated due to the utility of Girardi and other backpack items. There are only two SMGs in the game, but I want to talk about one that people often give a lot more heat than it really deserves. The Cleaner's Carbine. The Cleaner's Carbine is an interesting weapon. It has the hidden upside of slightly suppressing the sound of firing, making it a bit harder to hear, but that doesn't really do much in a game like TF2. I thought I'd mention it, it is there, since a lot of people don't really mention it. The main draw of this weapon is the other upside, the real upside, where dealing 100 damage with the Cleaner's Carbine will fill up your crikey meter. Activating the charge will grant you 8 seconds of mini crits on any of your weapons, including the Cleaner's Carbine itself, which means it can be paired quite well with something like the Bushwhacker. The downsides are a slight magazine reduction from 25 to just 20 and a flat 25% firing speed penalty. The Cleaner's Carbine is often hated as it is seen as a subpar weapon compared to the SMG, which is also seen as quite subpar to a lot of other weapons in Sniper's kit. While the Cleaner's Carbine is no minigun, it can put in the work. 100 damage, while it seems like a lot, and when you're having a bad game it definitely is, I know what that's like, On average, filling this meter is not going to be all that difficult. You'll at least get 1 to 2 in a single life. You'll then be granted 8 full seconds of mini crits, 35% extra damage with no fall off, which is actually pretty strong if you didn't know. And this thing doesn't have a damage penalty, so it does full SMG damage. However, if you would like to pair this thing with something else, pairing it with something like the Huntsman, so rather than leaving a light class like 5 health with a body shot, you'll now be able to kill light classes and even medics, leaving demos and pyros at 13 HP with a 162 damage arrow. Yeah, it's actually pretty good instead of 120, in case you didn't know. It can be paired with anything, and if you want to pair it with the weapon that was actually intended to be paired with, being the Hitman's Heatmaker, then you can. But I honestly don't find that these weapons synergize that well. They used to, and I'll kind of briefly touch on that in a little bit, but now they're just kind of together. They're both suppressed. That's really the only thing that's keeping them in the same set anymore. Then, of course, you have the good old-fashioned Bushwhacker combo. While yes, it is true, it's not as brain dead as it is with the Girardi, it is still viable, and you'll likely get fewer threats in chat if you use it this way. And 8 seconds of mini crits on anybody, not just people you soaked, is pretty cool. And it's also great for tank shredding. I had to bring that up. Of course, everybody knows if you're an MVM player, it is phenomenal for tank shredding since the tank does not require any additional damage in order to fill the meter. Just 100 damage to the tank, which is pretty much nothing, so it shreds tanks. The Cleaner's Carbine can still put in the work outside of this. While the damage is low, it can be enough to ward off enemies from pursuing you if you mag dump them. And you dump enough rounds into them in general, they'll probably run away. Or they'll be so low that pretty much a gust of wind will kill them. The Cleaner's Carbine, like I said, is no minigun, but it's not a bad secondary, and it often gets a bad rap. Mostly due to sharing a slot with easy to use stuff like Girardi and shields. Or maybe they're just old heads and remember when this thing offered you 3 seconds of crits on kill but fired 35% slaughter. I don't know, that's traumatic. And that's what I was kind of talking about earlier. Yes, this thing used to offer you 3 seconds of full crits on kill. There was no crikey meter. As long as you did anything, I guess as long as the finishing blow was from the Cleaner's Carbine, you would get 3 seconds of crits, which was pretty cool, but it doesn't work like that anymore. And honestly, it's better than it was then. Anyways, the Cleaner's Carbine and the SMG family of 2 as a whole are good weapons and should not be slept on as much as they are in my opinion. Now, time for the melees. Sniper's melees are properly rated, so I'm going to keep this segment brief compared to the others. The weapon I decided to choose for this slot, it was kind of difficult. I was thinking, should it be the Dropman Shiv? No, that weapon's pretty properly rated, and I don't think it's all that good at all, so not really going to talk about that one. Should it be the Bushwhacker? Yeah. Should it be stock? No, I think most people understand the reliability of stock with the exception of on Medic, but Medic does have the Ubersaw, and that's kind of its own situation. No, I decided for this segment to go with one of the most boring weapons in TF2, the Shahansha. The Shahansha is very simple. 25% less damage when above half, and then 25% more damage when below half health. Which means you can do 49 damage if you are above half health, and then you will deal 81 if you are below, making it better for getting in those last swings when you're closer to death, I guess. That's kind of the point of it. The Shahansha isn't hated, really it's not, but it's often considered useless, or rather just not that great, kind of boring, due to its simple nature. However, I've gotten out of many jams thanks to the additional damage that this thing offers when at low health. While random crits are BS, it has definitely saved me more than enough times from soldiers and demo knights in my time using this, because the crit damage is enough to deal with them in just a single swing, dealing 244 damage. Yeah, technically it does 146 damage if you are above half, but you wouldn't be able to deal with the soldier anyway. And even if without crits taking into account, this weapon isn't that bad. So, yeah, it's alright. Plus, it can now 3-hit soldiers and 2-hit medics, which is pretty neat, I guess. Yeah. But yeah, that's it for Sniper. I have nothing else to say. Let's finish this longer than intended video with the Spy. Specifically, Spy's revolvers, which are a fun topic for me. Believe it or not, Spy has a gun. Even though this seems to go over most Spy's heads, yes, he has a revolver. And they're all pretty good, and they all have their reasons to be used. But there is one that I think gets a little bit more flack than it really deserves. That one, without a doubt, has to be the Enforcer. The Enforcer has a long history, from being a straight upgrade when paired with the Dead Ringer, since its original downside made it so it took longer to cloak, but the Dead Ringer was instant. But then it was changed to just being kind of strong, to a little bit less strong, but still pretty dang strong, to almost useless, but not terrible, I guess, and then finally they buffed it, and it's now okay. It's an okay revolver. The current Enforcer has a 20% damage bonus while disguised, which means you get one shot with the additional damage, which brings your base damage from 40 to 48, which means if you're up close, it goes from 60 to 72. It also has the ability to pierce certain resistances like the Fist of Steel, Brass Beast, and Vaccinator Bubbles. Though this can be buggy sometimes, and it was really buggy when the stat was first added, but it has been mostly fixed, so it works for the most part. However, there is the downside of no random crits, which has a history of its own. It didn't originally have this no random crit stat, and unlike most weapons that do, it doesn't have an on-demand crit stat. It's just the fact that the crit does 144 damage, which was a little bit overkill, so that's why it has a downside, but its actual downside is a 20% slower firing speed. The reason that Enforcer is here is, well, because it's hated a little bit more than I think it really needs to be, you know? It's not the best revolver, but it's really not that bad. The Ambassador could have also been talked about here, but there are still spies who make good use of it. Plenty of spies who make good use of it. You know, so it's still relevant, but the Enforcer, nope, left to rot. I've heard people legit call it useless, and I think that's a bit of an overstatement. First, the 20% damage bonus while disguised means that if you're close enough, you can two-shot like classes, without having to hit headshots, which is nice. It also doesn't have ridiculous spread that the Ambassador does. On top of that, while piercing resistances of something like the Vaccinator sounds nice, it isn't very practical, but Wrangled Sentries, Fists of Steel, Dead Ringers, all a nice touch. And you may say, oh, just backstab him. Well, good luck doing that when he's in active combat with you, or if you'd have to go through many of his teammates in order to do anything. Using your gun is sometimes a requirement, and the Enforcer is pretty good. If you're disguised, like most spies would be at the time, you get an extra 20% damage bonus, which is really nice. And the downside is a 20% firing speed penalty, which is pretty minimal. This thing really doesn't have harsh downsides. The Enforcer is not a bad revolver, it's just kind of misunderstood, like me. Put in the work, and it isn't a bad pick if you don't want to deal with Ambassador shenanigans, or if you have enough morals not to use the Diamondback. Just so I don't have to do 4 segments, I'm going to talk about the next 2 together. I'm going to save the knife segment for its kind of own segment, I guess. But the Sapper and Watch, I'm going to combine them together so I don't have to say much individually. But, Enforcer, good. Well, there's only one Sapper unlock, and it's probably obvious that I'm not going to be speaking about the stock Sapper. And as for watches, there really isn't one that's bad, so I'm going to talk about the greatness of the Cloak and Dagger. Not really underrated, but I had to include something. The red tape recorder will go first. It has the upside of every 3 seconds de-leveling any building it's on. It used to be 1.6 seconds, but of course they had to overcorrect it, right? It only lasted about a day. Though yes, a level 3 could be turned into a level 1 over time, going from level 3 to level 2 to level 1, or if it's a level 2, going from level 2 to level 1. However, it comes with a 100% damage penalty, dealing no actual damage to the building, just slowly de-leveling it. Eventually, it will be able to destroy the building, but it takes much longer than the stock Sapper. People tend to think it's useless, but yeah, it's pretty good in 2 situations, those being mini-sentry engineers and groups of engineers. When there's a gunslinger engineer on the other team, chances are they're playing aggressive, and unless they are right next to their sentry, it is often worth just letting the mini go down and die in order to plop down a new one. You hear this all the time in defense of the red tape recorder, but it's true. A gunslinger engineer is less likely to try to go run over to wherever his sentry is and destroy the Sapper. It just makes more sense to wait for the Sapper to finish, kill the sentry, and then place down a new one. Well, the red tape recorder takes a lot longer to actually destroy the sentry, so there's a lot longer where there's no sentry on the battlefield. Sort of. The other situation is when there is a group of engineers. They'll be frantically trying to kill you and unsap their buildings, so if they manage to level down some buildings, making an impact where the stock Sapper really wouldn't have done anything. They're frantically trying to kill you and unsap their buildings, so you'll probably manage to down some buildings, making an impact where the stock Sapper just wouldn't have done anything, because it could easily just be repaired. Whereas now they gotta spend a whole 200, 400 metal or whatever, re-upgrading all their buildings. And then of course there's psyops. I mean, imagine, you're waiting to respawn, you can see your dispenser going down, but it's going down very, very slowly. It really takes a toll on the mind. Now for the Cloak and Dagger, it's a watch that's tied to your movement rather than time, so you can stay invisible indefinitely as long as you don't, well, move too much and deplete the meter. And even if you do deplete the meter, you'll just kind of show, I guess. It's like you kind of blink almost, but you're like half visible, basically. It has a 100% faster recharge rate for the downside of 35% less cloak back from ammo pickups and the inability to pick up ammo while you're actually invisible, though this can be circumvented by just decloaking and recloaking real quick, assuming that nobody's around. The Cloak and Dagger isn't underrated, I just needed something. All of Spy's watches are equally good in my opinion, unless they're really good at using the Dead Ringer, then the Dead Ringer kind of just takes the cake over everything else. Though the Cloak and Dagger is great for doing what Spy does best, waiting for the best moment to strike and pick. You have to play the game a bit slower, yeah, but it can allow you to more effectively position yourself if you're playing a map that doesn't have many ammo packs. This watch is just better for ensuring that you can get the strike at the right moment. The only thing that sucks is it drains very quickly, so you have to move very diligently. You can crouch, which will allow you to get more distance without depleting as much of the meter, but that means you have to move very, very slowly, which has screwed me over in the past. But it does have use cases. Both the Red Tape Recorder and Cloak and Dagger are not that bad, especially talking for the Red Tape Recorder. Sure, if you're an aggressive spy, the Red Tape sucks, but if you're a spy like me, who's more there to pester and occasionally pick, the Red Tape can be a great item for annoying the hell out of the other team. The Cloak and Dagger isn't underrated, I just needed something. This is it, the last weapon we have to cover. This was a long video, but we made it. The melee I decided to go with for Spy, and the last weapon we're going to have to talk about today, without a doubt, has to be the Spycicle, which may be a surprise to some of you, but I think a lot of you will understand why I picked it. The Spycicle is an interesting item. The knife works identically to stock for the most part, but puts up a giant middle finger to pyros, which I can't help but love. When hit by fire, you become immune to all fire damage for 1 second and afterburn damage for 10. However, you lose your knife for 15 seconds, though this can be expedited by picking up ammo packs. The only other downside is the fact that enemies get turned to ice statues, which will alert the enemy team that there is definitely a spy. Though typically, there's a spy on the other team, but I guess it's just most definitely going to alert them that there's a spy. I guess. It is a downside listed, so I need to bring it up. This weapon isn't disliked like some of the weapons I talked about. There isn't really a hatred for the Spycicle, but it seems to get left in the dust a little more often than a lot of the other knives. I was also contemplating talking about the Your Eternal Reward and how that wasn't really bad. Then I used it for a couple of games and realized how harsh that 33% cloak drain is. It just hits so hard, so the Spycicle it is. I really have little to say about it, to be honest. It's just a good knife. The Spycicle can make it a little bit easier to get out of jams when you come face to face with Pyro without any real downsides, and this has happened to me multiple times. Yeah, you can't use your knife for about 15 seconds, but pick up one of the million medium ammo packs just lying around and it'll reduce it by 7.5 seconds, do it again, and you're back in business. Yes, it has the possibility to mess up chain stabs, or cause you to have to retreat early when you could have gotten an extra stab because, a particle of fire hit you. Though in general, this does increase your survivability a lot more than it lowers it, and is worth it 90% of the time, since it's almost a straight upgrade to the stock knife. And when there's no Pyro on the other team, well then I guess it's a straight downgrade. But when is there not a Pyro on the other team, am I right? But yeah, I guess in that situation, not having Pyro on the other team, it's probably not that great to use, but, these are unlocks, they're situational, they're side grades. Like I said, there are cases where this knife isn't great, but That goes for all weapons for the most part. The Spicicle is a good knife for getting those picks and giving a middle finger to those mumbling ashbags. That'll do it. That is all I have for the video. It took about a month to put this thing together, so I hope you enjoyed it. Tell me if you agree. Did I miss any weapons? Or are there other reasons that you can bring up for why I was right, or reasons I am wrong? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. Anyways, thanks for watching. I'll catch you guys later.
It looks like you lost another.